Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself. Chapter 8, second subdivision of logic, the doctrine of essence. Quasi-subdivision C, actuality. Infra-subdivision B, relationship of causality. Encyclopedia paragraph 153 and the notes beyond it. Substance is cause. Insofar as substance reflects into self, as against its passage into accidentality, and so stands as the primary fact, but again no less suspends this reflection into self, its bare possibility, lays itself down as the negative or of itself, and thus produces an effect, an actuality, which, though so far only assumed as a sequence, is through the process that effectuates it at the same time necessary. Everything that follows the first paragraph of an encyclopedia paragraph is the note. When Hegel says, review encyclopedia paragraph 153, he means the first paragraph. Whether it's a sentence or two or it's an extremely long part. Now, if that first paragraph has parts to it, he may also, that are labeled B or C or alpha or similar, he may also mean that. And so that is reflected in the outline. When a paragraph also has parts, I will include those parts underneath the paragraph. Otherwise, the notes are everything that follows the first paragraph. And in this case, it begins, as primary fact, the cause is qualified as having absolute independence and a subsistence maintained in face of the effect. But in the necessity whose identity constitutes that primariness itself, it is wholly passed into the effect. So far again as we can speak of a definite content, there is no content in the effect that is not in the cause. That identity, in fact, is the absolute content itself. But it is no less also the form characteristic. The primariness of the cause is suspended in the effect in which the cause makes itself a dependent being. The cause, however, does not for that reason vanish and leave the effect to be alone actual. For this dependency is in the like manner, directly suspended, and is rather the reflection of the cause and effect, its primariness. In short, it is in the effect that the cause first becomes actual and a cause. The cause, consequently, is in its full truth, cosa sui. Jacobi, sticking to the partial conception of mediation, in his letters on Spinoza, the second edition, page 416, has treated the causa sui and the effectus sui in the same, which is the absolute truth of the cause as a mere formalism. He has also made the remark that God ought to be defined not as the ground of things, but essentially as cause. A more thorough consideration of nature of cause would have shown that Jacobi did not by this mean A more thorough consideration of the nature of cause would have shown that Jacobi did not by this means gain what he intended. Even in the finite cause and its conception, we can see this identity between cause and effect in point of content. The rain, the cause, and the wet, the effect, are the self-same existing water. In point of form, the cause, rain, is dissipated or lost in the effect, wet. But in that case, the result can no longer be described as effect. For without the cause, it is nothing, and we should have only the unrelated wet left. In the common acceptation of the causal relation, the cause is finite, to such extent as its content is so, as is also the case with finite substance, and so far as cause and effect are conceived as two several independent existences, which they are, however, only when we leave the causal relation out of sight. In the finite sphere, we never get over the difference of the form characteristics in their relation, and hence we turn the matter round and define the cause also as something dependent or as an effect. This again has another cause, and thus there grows up a progress from effects to causes ad infinitum. There is a descending progress too. The effect, looked at in its identity with the cause, is itself defined as a cause, and at the same time as another cause, which again has other effects, and so on forever. The way understanding bristles up against the idea of substance is equaled by its readiness to use the relation of cause and effect. Whenever it is proposed to view any sum of fact as necessary, it is especially the relation of causality to which the reflective understanding makes a point of tracing it back. Now, although this relation does undoubtedly belong to necessity, it forms only one aspect in the process of that category. That process equally requires the suspension of mediation involved in causality and the exhibition of it as simple self-relation. If we stick to causality as such, we have it only in its truth. Such a causality is merely finite, and its finitude lies in retaining the distinction between cause and effect unassimilated. But these two terms, if they are distinct, are also identical. Even in ordinary consciousness, that identity may be found. Even in ordinary consciousness, that identity may be found. We say that a cause is a cause only when it has an effect, and vice versa. But cause and effect are thus one and the same content. And the distinction between them is primarily only that the one lies down and the other is laid down. This formal difference, however, again suspends itself because the cause is not only a cause of something else, but also a cause of itself, while the effect is not only an effect of something else, but also an effect of itself. The finitude of things consists accordingly in this. While cause and effect are in their notion identical, the two forms present the two forms present themselves severed so that though the cause is also an effect, and the effect is also a cause, the cause is not an effect in the same connection as in its Pardon. While cause and effect are in their notion identical, the two forms present themselves severed so that, though the cause is also an effect and the effect also a cause, the cause is not an effect in the same connection as it is a cause, nor the effect a cause in the same connection as it is an effect. This again gives the infinite progress in the shape of an endless series of causes, which shows itself at the same time as an endless series of effects. I'm recording on Ray-Ban Stories by the Meta Corporation. They were formerly called Facebook Stories. If you notice a pause, it is because I have paused the recording, and before I can begin again, there is a blinking light inside the sunglasses. I have the Wayfarers, which alerts me when I can continue. So there are some pauses in it, and I apologize for the effect. Encyclopedia section or encyclopedia paragraph 144, the effect is different from the cause. The former, as such, has a being dependent on the latter, but such a dependence is likewise reflection into self and immediacy and the action of the cause, as it constitutes the effect, is at the same time the pre-constitution of the effect. So long as effect is kept separate from cause, there is thus already in existence another substance on which the effect takes place. As immediate, this substance is not a self-related negativity and active, but passive. Yet it is a substance, and it is therefore active also. It therefore suspends the immediacy it was originally put forward with, and the effect which was put into it. It reacts, in essence, suspends the activity of the first substance, but this first substance also in the same way sets aside its own immediacy or the effect which is put into it. It thus suspends the activity of the other substance and reacts. In this manner, causality passes into the relation of action and reaction, or reciprocity. In reciprocity, although causality is not yet invested with its true characteristic, the rectilinear movement out from the causes to effects, and from effects to causes, is bent round and back into itself, and thus the progress ad infinitum of causes and effects is, as a progress, really and truly suspended. This bend, which transforms the infinite progression into a self-contained relationship, is here as always the plain reflection that in the above meaningless repetition there is only one and the same thing. We view this as one cause and another, and their connection with one another. Reciprocity, which is the development of this relation itself, however, only distinguishes turn and turnabout, not causes, but factors and causation, in each of which, just because they are inseparable, on the principle of the identity that the cause is cause in the effect, and vice versa, the other factor is also equally supposed. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, The Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic, The Doctrine of Essence, Quasi-Subdivision C, Actuality, Infra-Subdivision, C. Reciprocity or action and reaction. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic, the Doctrine of Essence. Quasi-subdivision C, Actuality, infra-subdivision C, Reciprocity or action and reaction. Encyclopedia paragraph 155. The characteristics which in reciprocal action are retained as distinct are alpha, potentially the same. The one side is a cause, its primary, active, passive, and the like, just as the other is, similarly, the presupposition of another side and the action upon it, the immediate primariness and the dependence produced by the alternation are one and the same on both sides. The cause assumed to be first is on account of its immediacy passive, a dependent being, and an effect. The distinction of the causes spoken of as two and accordingly void. The distinction of the causes spoken of as two is accordingly void, and properly speaking, there is only one cause, which, while it suspends itself as substance and its effect, also rises in this operation only to independent existence as a cause. Encyclopedia, paragraph 156. But this unity of the double cause is also beta actual. All this alternation is properly the cause and act of constituting itself, and in such constitution lies in its being. The nullity of the distinctions is not only potential, are a reflection of ours. See Encyclopedia paragraph 155. Reciprocal action just means that each characteristic we impose is also to be suspended and inverted into its opposite, and that in this way the essential nullity of the moments is explicitly stated. An effect is introduced into the primariness. In other words, the primariness is abolished. The action of a cause becomes reaction, and so on. Reciprocal action realizes the causal relation in its complete development. It is this relation, therefore, in which reflection usually takes shelter. When the conviction grows that things can no longer be studied satisfactorily from a causal point of view, on account of the infinite progress already spoken of. Thus, in historical research, the question may be raised in a first form whether the character and manners of a nation are the cause of its constitution and its laws, or if they are not rather the effect. Then, as the second step, Then, as a second step, the character and manners on one side and the constitution and laws on the other are conceived on the principle of reciprocity. And in that case, the cause is the same connection as it is a cause, will at the same time be an effect, and vice versa. The same thing is done in the study of nature, and especially of living organisms. There, the several organs and functions are similarly seen to stand to each other in the relation of reciprocity. Reciprocity is undoubtedly the proximate truth of the relation of cause and effect, and stands, so to say, on the threshold of the notion. But on that very ground, supposing that our aim is a thoroughly comprehensive idea, we should not rest content with applying this relation. If we get no further than studying a given content under the point of view of reciprocity, we are taking up an attitude which leaves matters utterly incomprehensible. We are left with a mere dry fact, and the call for mediation, which is the chief motive in applying the relation of causality, is still unanswered, and it we look more narrowly into the dissatisfaction felt in applying the relation of reciprocity. We shall see that it consists in the circumstance that this relation, instead of being treated as an equivalent for the notion, ought first of all to be known and understood in its own nature, and to understand the relation of action and reaction, we must not let the two sides rest in their state of mere given facts, but recognize them, as has been shown in the two paragraphs preceding, for factors of a third and higher, which is the notion and nothing else. To make, for example, the manners of the Spartans the cause of their constitution, and their constitution, conversely, the cause of their manners, may no doubt be in a correct way. But as we have comprehended neither the manners nor the constitution of the nation, the result of such reflections can never be final or satisfactory. The satisfactory point will be reached only when these two, as well as all other special aspects of Spartan life and Spartan history, are seen to be founded in this notion. Encyclopedia, section 157. This pure self reciprocation is therefore necessity unveiled or realized. The link of necessity, qua necessity, is identity, as still inward and concealed, because it is the identity of what are esteemed actual things, although their very self subsistence is bound to be necessity. The circulation of substance through causality and reciprocity, therefore, only expressly makes out our states, that self subsistence is the indefinite, the circulation of substance through causality and reciprocity, therefore only expressly makes out or states that self subsistence is the infinite negative self relation, a relation negative in general, for in it the act of distinguishing and intermediating becomes a primariness of actual things, independent one against the other, and infinite self relation, because their independence only lies in their identity. Encyclopedia, paragraph 158. This truth of necessity, therefore, is freedom, and the truth of substance is the notion, and independence which, though self repulsive into distinct independent elements, yet in that repulsion is self identical, and in the movement of reciprocity, still at home and conversant only with itself. Necessity is often called hard, and rightly so. If we keep only to necessity as such, in essence, to its immediate shape, here we have first of all some state or, generally speaking, fact possessing an independent subsistence, and necessity primarily implies that these falls upon such a fact something else by which it is brought low. This is what is hard and sad in necessity, immediate or abstract. The identity of the two things which necessity represents as bound to each other, and thus bereft of their independence, is at first only inward and therefore has no existence for those under the yoke of necessity. Freedom, too, from this point of view, is only abstract, and is preserved only by renouncing all that we immediately are and have. But as we have already but as we have seen already, the process of necessity is so directed that it overcomes the rigid externality which it first had and reveals its inward nature. It then appears that the members linked to one another are not really foreign to each other, but only elements of one whole, each of them in its connection with the other, being as it were at home and combining with itself. In this way, necessity is transfigured into freedom, not the freedom that consists in abstract negation, but freedom concrete and positive, from which we may learn what a mistake it is to regard freedom and necessity as mutually exclusive. Necessity, indeed, qua necessity, is far from being freedom. Yet freedom presupposes necessity and contains it as an unsubstantial element in itself. A good man is aware that the tenor of his conduct is essentially obligatory and necessary. But this consciousness is so far from making any abatement from his freedom that without it, real and reasonable freedom could not be distinguished from arbitrary choice, a freedom which has no reality and is merely potential. A criminal, when punished, may look upon his punishment as a restriction of his freedom. Really, the punishment is not foreign constraint to which he is subjected, but the manifestation of his own acts. And if he recognizes this, he comports himself as a free man. In short, man is most independent when he knows himself to be determined by the absolute idea throughout. It was this phase of mind and conduct which Spinoza called amor intellectualis de, or as Google Translate says it,
Amor intellectualis Dei.
intellectual love of God. Encyclopedia paragraph 159. Thus, the notion in the truth of being in essence, inasmuch as the shining or show of self reflection is itself at the same time independent immediacy, and this being of a different actuality is immediately only a shining or show on itself. The notion has exhibited itself as the truth of being in essence, as the ground to which the regress of both leads. Conversely, it has been developed out of being as its ground. The former aspect of the advance may be regarded as a concentration of being into its depth, thereby disclosing its inner nature, the latter aspect as an issuing of the more perfect from the less perfect. When such development is viewed on the latter side only, it does prejudice to the method of philosophy. The special meaning which these superficial thoughts of more imperfect and more perfect have in this place is to indicate the distinction of being as an immediate unity with itself from the notion as free meditation, as free mediation with itself. Since being has shown that it is an element in notion, since being has shown that it is an element in the notion, the latter has thus exhibited itself as the truth of being. as this its reflection in itself, and as an absorption of the mediation, the notion is the presupposition of the immediate, a presupposition which is identical with the return to self. And in this identity lie freedom and the notion. If the partial element therefore be called the imperfect, then the notion, or the perfect, is certainly a development from the imperfect, since its very nature is thus to suspend its presupposition. At the same time, it is the notion alone which, in the act of supposing itself, makes its presupposition, as has been made apparent in causality, in general and especially in reciprocal action. Thus, in reference to being in essence, the notion is defined as essence, reverted to the simple immediacy of being, the shining or show of essence, therefore having actuality, and its actuality being at the same time a free shining or show in itself. In this manner, the notion has being as its simple self relation, or as the immediacy of its immanent unity. Being is so poor a category that it is the least thing which can be shown to be found in the notion. The passage from necessity to freedom, or from actuality into the notion, is the very hardest, because it proposes that independent actuality shall be thought as having all its substantiality in the passing over an identity with the other independent actuality. The notion, too, is extremely hard, because it is itself just this very identity. But the actual substance as such, the cause, which in its exclusiveness resists all invasion, is ipso facto subjected to necessity or the destiny of passing into dependency. And it is this subjection rather than the chief hardness lies. And it is this subjection, rather, where the chief hardness lies. To think necessity, on the contrary, rather tends to melt that hardness. For thinking means that in the other one meets with oneself. It means a liberation which is not the flight of abstraction, but consists in that which is actual, having itself not as something else, but as its own being and creation in the other actuality with which it is bound up by the force of necessity. As existing in an individual form, this liberation is called I. As developed to its totality, it is free spirit. As feeling, it is love, and as enjoyment, it is blessedness. The great vision of substance in Spinoza is only a potential liberation from finite exclusiveness and egoism, but the notion itself realizes from its own both the power and necessity of actual freedom. When, as now, the notion is called the truth of being in essence, we must expect to be asked, why do we not begin with the notion? The answer is that where knowledge by thought is our aim, we cannot begin with the truth, because the truth, when it forms the beginning, must rest on mere assertion. The truth, when it is thought, must as such verify itself to thought. If the notion were put at the head of logic and defined quite correctly in point of content as the unity of being in essence, the following question would come up. What are we to think under the terms being and essence? And how do they come to be embraced in the unity of the notion? But if we answer these questions, then our beginning with the notion would be merely nominal. The real start would be made with being, as we have done here, with this difference. that the characteristics of being as well as those of essence would have to be accepted uncritically from the figurative conception, whereas we have observed being and essence in their own dialectical developments and learnt how they lose themselves in the unity of the notion. This is the end of chapter 8.